Hello and welcome to today's Network Mind Out webinar. My name is Sally Morris. I'm the National Mind Out Project Coordinator of Mind Out at the National LGBTI Health Alliance. Today's webinar is an introduction to LGBTI mental health. Before we start, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on which we're gathering today and to pay our respects to elders past and present and emerging. For the webinar, we're going to be, over the next sort of 45 to 50 minutes, is talk about some basic context to LGBTI mental health. For today's webinar, if you're having any problems with audio or video, there is a chat box on your lower left-hand side of your screen where you could type a message and let me know if you're having any problems. And throughout today's webinar, I'll be taking questions at the end. For you to submit questions, there is a green speech bubble with a question mark in it in the top centre of your screen. So if you select there, you can type a question and the questions will be go through at the end depending on how much time we have. Just mindful, this is an introduction to LGBTI mental health, so there will be some topics and concepts that we won't be able to get deeply into today, but please tune in for other webinars to explore some of those contexts a bit further. So really for today's webinar, like I said, it is an introduction. Yes, I'm more than happy to, can share a link to the PowerPoint presentation, both during this webinar and also it will be made available on the Alliance website afterwards. And also today's webinar will be recorded. And so we'll be able to share quite broadly with your colleagues who might not be able to attend today. So today's webinar intention is really just to give people a basic understanding of diverse bodies, genders, sexualities, relationships, and have a greater understanding of the mental health outcomes for LGBTI people. And so really what we're going to be covering today is who are LGBTI people and communities, touching on terminology, language and labels, the lived experience of being LGBTI, and how this relates to mental health outcomes. So like I said, this basic introduction webinar, but is really helpful to help know what these foundational concepts are before delving into some deeper conversations. So we really like to start at the beginning. So this concept of what is LGBTI. So this acronym, which I'll be using a lot today, stands for the words lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex. But what we're actually really talking about when we talk about LGBTI is we're talking about sexualities, genders, bodies, and relationships. And this is important for us to note that LGBTI is not a homogenous community, that actually the acronym LGBTI is made up of a diversity of identities and experiences and histories. So I'll be unpacking this in a bit more depth to understand. And I guess this is important for us to, when we're talking about mental health outcomes, to understand how different experiences and different outcomes will impact different parts of the LGBTI communities. When we're talking about language, and people will probably be coming across a diversity of language and acronyms within our communities. At the National LGBTI Health Alliance, we utilise LGBTI as our acronym that we use. But it's really important to acknowledge that other communities and other locations around Australia will use different language. And certainly it may be appropriate and necessary to use different language in different contexts. So some places will insert a Q into the acronym as well as other letters as well. And really, essentially, there is no single right or wrong answer to this. I think our communities are still exploring language, and our language and how we talk about ourselves is going to be continuing to change. And really, this is a part of our communities evolving over time. People exploring new concepts of ways of being, and also about a greater awareness about how language stigmatizes groups of people. And certainly there's a mirroring that we see in the mental health space, where the language we've used in the mental health sector has really changed and evolved over time as we've become more aware of how the language we use creates supportive or unsupportive environments. So I guess what I'm asking in this space with the LGBTI communities is that I actually sometimes won't be able to give you firm definitions because different words will mean different things to different people. And in different communities, different languages will be used. So I'm encouraging people to be okay with the evolving nature of language and to practice using different languages and being okay that if in the near future there will be new words emerging. So just becoming okay with that. For today's webinar, we'll utilise the acronym LGBTI, but at the same time acknowledging that this is a term we use at a convenience, and we will be talking about the diversity of sexualities, diversity of genders, diversity of bodies, and diversity of relationships, regardless of what other words people might be using to describe those experiences. So I'm going to break down this LGBTI acronym for people, and this diagram with the genderbread person can be a useful tool to help people describe the complexities that's within the LGBTI space. I always like to start at the end of our acronym with the I, mostly because this is the space that I believe that most people know least about. And for many people, the word intersex is actually a brand new word for them. Effectively, what we're talking about here is our bodies, and that when we're born, the doctors take quite a cursory look at our genitals and assign us a gender based on what our genitals look like. However, Mother Nature is nowhere near that dull, and there's a bunch more diversity to male and female bodies in our human nature. So intersex are people who have bodies that don't nicely fit those categories of male or female. And this is in chromosomes, sex organs, hormones, lots of different variations. And so the language we're using in this space is people with intersex variations or variations in sex characteristics. Regardless of whether someone has an intersex variation or not, or what someone's body looks like, generally many people are assigned either male or female at birth on their birth certificate, on their legal documents. So sometimes regardless of whether someone has an intersex variation or not, what sex is assigned at birth still has a really significant impact on their life about what they can access. For example, schooling institutions, what sports people can engage with, which public toilets people are able to access. So this is, so this is a space that for many people in the LGBTI communities is very invisible, and many people aren't aware of intersex. So certainly, for people, this might be a new space, and I really encourage people to get out there and learn and explore. And two really great places where you can go to do that is OII and AISSGA. And these are two intersex-led organisations here in Australia who provide really great information about what is intersex, and provide really significant information about experiences and health needs of intersex people, and also about what the intersex community is needing from the rest of us to support their health and well-being. And when we're talking about intersex variations, it's important to note that there isn't just a single intersex variation. There are about 40 odd different types of intersex variations, and so there's not a single way of experiencing being intersex. That in of itself, intersex is a really diverse space as well. And I'm certainly not going to be able to do intersex justice in this webinar, so I certainly really encourage people to go out there and learn, explore, and listen to stories. And also, when we're talking about each of these parts of the LGBTI communities, I like to invite people to reflect upon how these experiences or identities spoken about in the public space. So when we think about intersex or people's bodies as male or female, or as neither male nor female, how is that spoken about in the media? What are we hearing in the world around us? The next part of our acronym, so moving from the I towards the T, moving towards the beginning of the acronym, but still at the end, is around T for transgender. And what we're actually talking about here is gender. So gender, so whereas our bodies are stable, constant ways of being, gender is actually our internal sense of identity and refers to the way someone feels as male and or female. And so words we have in this space are, female, woman, male, man. And the term transgender is used to describe people who experience their gender that is different to the body that they've been born into. So we might call a body a male body, but their gender would be female. And certainly there's a really diversity of language in this space. And certainly as people are exploring the spaces within and between the binary of male and female. So people are looking at the spaces in between that. And because of that, there's a whole bunch of language happening around that. So when people are looking at their experience of being both male and female, or neither male or female, or that perhaps their gender might move between those two concepts. So we hear language such as genderqueer, gender neutral, agendered. Also up on the screen there, I have the word cisgender, C-I-S gender. The word cisgender has emerged as an opposite to transgender. So cisgender describes someone whose gender identity matches the gender of their body. So rather than saying someone's not transgender, we can utilise the word cisgender. Yes, and absolutely. So when we're talking about gender, there are a really vast number of language that's emerging in this space. Certainly non-binary and gender diverse are also other language and terminology. And certainly I guess this is also where I can't necessarily give you firm definitions of what each of these words mean, because each of these words and language will mean different things to different people. And certainly there's lots of emerging language and evolving language in this gender space. And same as with intersex, before I move on to that, just remembered I had another slide there. So when we're also talking about gender, so just then I was talking about gender identity, but also alongside with gender is gender expression. So gender expression is all about how we demonstrate our gender to the world through the way that we act and dress and behave and interact, based on these traditional gender roles of masculine and feminine. And certainly when we're talking about gender and gender expression, we are talking about these as social constructs. So these are created by the society in which we live. And one of the ways that we know that gender is a social construct is that it has changed over time. The way that we do gender has changed over time, and also how different cultures do gender differently. So what is seen as masculine or feminine or male or female in our white Western Australian culture can be quite different to what male or female or masculine and feminine looks like in other cultures. So this is certainly a really changing space. So also related to gender, which is really important, is the concept of pronouns. So in our English language, a pronoun is a word that takes place of a person's name when we're speaking. So using the word she or her or hers in place of a woman's name. And certainly for transgender people, pronouns are really important as someone how they're presenting to the world, their gender is changing. Often they encounter experiences of people using the wrong pronoun. So we use the word misgendering to talk about when the wrong pronouns are used, whether this is accidental or intentional. Because our language and English language is so gendered, this sometimes can be really difficult for people to adapt to, and I really encourage people to practice with pronouns, and I guess in English we have the opportunity to use gender neutral pronouns such as using they, theirs or them instead of gendered pronouns of he or her, his or her. So for example, instead of saying someone is here for her appointment, you can say someone is here for their appointment. And certainly always using someone's name in place of pronouns can also be really helpful, especially when you're uncertain of which pronoun someone might use. But I also like to give the invitation for people to, if you're uncertain about what pronouns someone utilises, to ask someone. And generally, it's considered quite respectful to confirm with someone what pronouns they use, rather than guessing and using what might be the wrong pronouns. This can be a bit of a struggle for some people, so I really encourage people just to practice, and the more time you practice with pronouns, the easier it comes over time. As also with the intersex community, I really encourage people to get out there and explore more about gender. And I apologise for my formatting. When I've uploaded the slides, the web addresses have moved over onto 2 lines instead of being on 1. So these are places where you can go and look at fact sheets and gather more information about gender and trans people and gender diversity and non-binary genders. And certainly there's going to be many more other services and places out there you can gather information, but here are some places where you can start, and certainly these spaces would be able to lead you on to other places where you can gather additional information as well. And then the beginning of our acronym is around sexuality. So the LGB part of our acronym it refers to sexuality. So sexuality is about who a person is physically, sexually, romantically, and emotionally attracted to. Whether that's to men, women with the same gender or other gender. And the words that we generally use to describe sexuality is based on someone's gender in relation to the person's gender they're attracted to. So I'm sure everyone can appreciate that as we are unpacking gender and reframing and changing how we talk about gender, how we also talk about sexuality is also shifting. And so also there are a really vast number of identities and terminologies that people will use to talk about their sexuality, particularly as gender is being shifted. So traditional labels would be lesbian, gay, bisexual, but there's other labels such as pansexual, which refers to people who are attracted to all people regardless of gender, the term queer and asexual. And again, these words, there'll be a whole range of other words that people will use to describe their sexuality, and these words can really mean different things to different people, and so this is again a really evolving and emerging space as people looking beyond the binary of male, female, gay, straight. So people are really exploring the spaces within and between those binary boxes, which we're sort of seeing more and more. And again, here's a couple of places where you can go to access some more resources about sexuality. I imagine that for many people, sexuality is probably what they're most familiar with. But however, there's always more things that can be learnt. But if there's something that I've just touched on in this really quick whirlwind tour of the LGBTI space, I really encourage you to go out and to contact organisations and to do some research of your own, to find out more about terminology and experiences as well. When we're talking around sexuality, and this framework can also sometimes be useful when we're talking about gender as well, is that it's more than the words people use to describe themselves. That the words lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, these are identities. These are actually simply words that we use to describe ourselves, and they usually use them as a shortcut way to describe to someone else the complexity of who we are. But underneath identity, identity actually may not be the same as the behaviours that someone is engaging with. And it actually may not be the same as the feelings they're experiencing. That for many people, the internal feelings that they have, the behaviours that they engage in, and the identities that they utilise might not actually be the same. As we go through this webinar, I'll touch on a little bit about why that is. But I think the most important message I can probably give to people is actually, at the end of the day, the words that people use to describe themselves might not be actually the most important things you need to know about someone, particularly if you're trying to support someone. So there would be LGBTI people out there who might not use those words to describe themselves, and for a range of different reasons. And often those reasons can come back to stigma and experiences of discrimination. It might be that finding the right word that fits to describe their experience. But really, at the end of the day, the core message being here that the words that we use to describe ourselves are probably not the most important things about us. These are actually shortcut ways to describe ourselves to another person. And hence was what I was saying before about different words, different identities can have vastly different meanings to different people. So sometimes the question might be, oh, okay, you identify as queer, that's really interesting. Can you tell me a little bit about what queer means to you? How do you experience being queer? Rather than making an assumption about this is what the word queer is and everybody who uses that identity must adhere to these certain rules about what that looks like. Because that's very restricting and actually not representative of the experience within our communities. When we also talk about LGBTI communities, we often get asked the question of how many LGBTI people there are. In short, the answer is we actually don't know. This is not data that's routinely collected in any way in Australia, and in fact not in most Western or any countries. Certainly is not captured in the census. And also, I guess, reflecting on the previous slide around feelings, behaviour and identities, it also really depends on what question is asked. Is it asked about how people identify, or is it asked about behaviour? So I have a few stats on the screen here, and I've got the references up the top right-hand of the screen there. But essentially, when we ask whether people identify with certain identities, we get a smaller portion of people go, yes, I identify as being that word. And when we ask about behaviours or feelings, we get a larger portion of people going, yes, I identify with engaging with those behaviours, or I identify with having those feelings. And when we talk about intersex variations, because this is foundational, it's not being intersex non-identity, it's quite consistent, but different intersex variations would be more common. So basically, roughly around 1.7% of the population have an intersex variation. Some intersex variations are more common than others. So for intersex people, that's around as common as people with red hair or people who are left-handed. So much more common than probably what many of us would be aware of. So I guess when we're asking about how many LGBTI people there, it really depends on the context. But I think what we certainly can say is LGBTI people certainly make up a significant portion of our population, whether we can see them there or not. And same when it also comes when we talk about LGBTI communities. It's really helpful to remember that people within these communities, so people who might fall in this definition of LGBTI, may or may not actually identify with those words of being LGBTI. They might not know anyone else who's LGBTI. They might not be publicly visible with LGBTI communities or organisations, and certainly may not feel welcomed or comfortable attending LGBTI events and services. And many LGBTI people actually may simply live their lives and identify as heterosexual. So this is where we acknowledge the limitations of using language around LGBTI, and certainly why at the Alliance we like to really expand that out and talk about diverse bodies, diverse genders, diverse sexualities and diverse relationships, because we know that the terminology LGBTI or LGBTI communities is not something that all people who we're wanting to reach would actually identify with that language. But when we're talking about health promotion and health and wellbeing, we'd be wanting to reach a much broader group of people than those who strictly identify with being LGBTI. Here's a link, I guess, so that beginning part was very much who are LGBTI people, and one of the other ways you can really connect with who are LGBTI people in communities is by listening to our stories. And Up on the page there is a link to the QLife videos. These are a series of stories put together of the lives and experiences of LGBTI people within Australia. So I really encourage people to watch them. There's some really amazing, heartfelt and insightful stories of the daily lived experience of LGBTI people in Australia. And also when we're talking about LGBTI, before this next section where I'm going to be talking about the lived experience of LGBTI people, I think it's really important to note that, and particularly as I'm going to be delving into the impact of stigma, but actually the lives of LGBTI people and communities have really been shaped by both a personal and cultural history of both stigma and resilience. That stigma and resilience isn't an either or, that you're either not vulnerable or resilient, but actually for LGBTI people, being vulnerable and resilient coexist at the same time, two sides of the same coin rather than this either or. I think when we talk about vulnerabilities and resilience, we talk about either you're resilient or you're not, or you're vulnerable and you're not. And as we're talking around the lived experience of being LGBTI, I think it's vital to remember that those two things coexist and it's not an either or discussion. And just to keep that in mind, as I'm going to be getting into experiences of vulnerabilities, I think it's vital to remember that that is important often for us to do that, to promote, for people to become aware of what the health outcomes are. But it's really important that our focus on negative health outcomes is not the only, it's a one-dimensional picture of who LGBTI people are. So when we're talking about the lived experiences of LGBTI people and communities, it's really important to remember that there's a very long history of oppression and prejudice, persecution and fear and hatred of LGBTI people. That's persisted throughout history, and for many, it's actually, this is still a current experience. And historically, being gay and transgender has been a mental illness. It's been considered a sin. It's been illegal. It's been considered immoral, a social taboo, and certainly. Recent public debates around LGBTI communities has really demonstrated that many of these perceptions are still actually very current and real in our communities. And so that does really have a direct impact. So this is not only a history that's disconnected from us, this is a history that is still, it's very recent history and a very real current history that is still happening. But this history does shape how we experience our lives as LGBTI people today. And so when we're talking about that history, that history also really shapes social and cultural norms. Consciously and subconsciously, we receive lots of messages about who we should be as people in our society, about how we should dress, how we should behave, how we should interact with others, what relationships we should have, what goals we should have in life. And these messages are shaped by our families, our communities, our role models, our schooling systems, legislation, our religions, advertising, and these social norms that really tell us lots of messages about who we should be and how we should be. And for many people, if who they are matches these social and cultural norms, you tend not to actually notice these in the world around you. But if your experience of who you are as a person is in contrast to these messages receiving, you really notice. And one of the things that does certainly link LGBTI people, so people with diverse relationships, diverse sexualities, diverse bodies, diverse genders, is that all of those experiences sit outside these social and cultural norms about what we're told we should be, which is often very, often talk about boxes, very black and white about what we can be and what we can't. So as LGBTI people, we often sit outside of those social norms about who we are expected to be in society. And I guess here's a little image to sort of demonstrate, I guess, as LGBTI people, we're more than our sexuality, we're more than our gender, and we're more than our body, that we all have a variety of different aspects that contribute to who we are as people, where we live, how old we are, what is our health, what is our culture, what is our faith, as well as what is our gender and sexuality. And all these different aspects interrelate with each other and impact on each other. And all of these parts of ourselves are impacted by these external messages, so these social and cultural norms. So what are the values in our community? What is my status in community? What's my role in my family? All these external messages determine how these different parts of our identities align or how they might clash. And certainly we notice that there are certain spaces that can clash a lot with LGBTI identities. And we often talk about these as intersectionalities, when as an LGBTI person, you also have another identity or another experience of who you are that might either align or clash with being LGBTI. How do these different identities and experiences support each other, or do they challenge each other? So in this space, it's really important to think about how culture, so Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people experience being LGBTI. If you're from a different culture, if you live in a rural regional area, your age, being an older person or younger person, if you come from a faith or religion, or you have a disability, and there's many more, but how do these other experiences of who you are as a person fit or not fit with being LGBTI? And certainly I'm not going to have an opportunity to delve into all of these intersectionalities. And I really encourage people, if you're watching and you work with a particular group of people that has that intersectional experience, to again get out there and explore. And certainly a number of the resources that we've created at Alliance is trying to bring awareness to these experiences of intersections between LGBTI and another experience. In particular, we've been doing lots of work around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and communities. And so certainly even language will be different in these spaces. So the language that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples use to talk about sexuality and gender can be quite different to our white Western way of talking about sexuality and gender. So there's a whole other layer there for people to explore, and I really encourage you to do so. So when we're talking about the lived experience of being LGBTI, a really important concept is this concept of heteronormativity. So heteronormativity is the general assumption that everyone is straight, cisgendered, and they fit the concepts of male and female, and that those being that is actually seen as the norm and therefore superior. Often heteronormativity happens in subtle, tiny ways. Earlier went about pronouns. This could be when someone assumes what your pronoun should be based on how you're appearing, or they're assuming the pronoun of your partner based on your gender. And so often it's just this space where LGBTI people can actually become very invisible. It's just this automatic assumption that everyone is straight and cisgendered and male or female. And in of itself would see quite innocuous and quite minute. But actually the impact is quite significant, because LGBTI people can feel really invisible, excluded, unimportant. And also this is this moment of, do I share who I am with the people around me? And what informs that decision, I guess, is if you're engaging with a health provider or a friend or a community member, and there's an assumption made about who you should be based on social norms, there's this moment of, do I disclose who I am? And there's lots of information that LGBTI people use to make that decision about, do I tell you who I am? And that decision is informed by lots of things. Myths and stereotypes is certainly a really big thing. So myths are these unproven or false beliefs around LGBTI people and other groups of people. And usually these myths are usually used to justify a particular value. For example, that LGBTI people aren't as worthy or valuable or meaningful or as ethical as other people. And a stereotype is a simplified or over generalization. Often heard stereotypes are described as like a one-dimensional picture of a much, much more complex person, that you, for example, you see someone purely as being a gay person rather than, a gay person who also has a family and has a profession and has a culture and has a history. That's a much more complex story. And I guess so these stereotypes, they influence how we act towards each other. And generally these myths and stereotypes are particularly usually quite negative and really result in little positive recognition of the diversity and value that LGBTI people bring. And myths and stereotypes really also feed stigma. So myths often are used to justify a particular value. And so those values then become stigma and prejudice. So the actual is not just a myth anymore, but it becomes an opinion, a belief, or an attitude about a group of people that's actually based on that misinformation about this story that people assume to be true around LGBTI people. And stigma is that negative reaction in response to being perceived as being LGBTI, that the belief that being LGBTI is not a good thing, that that's not something anyone would want to be. And if you get mistaken as being LGBTI, that is seen as being offensive. So there's this, we also already can see the valuing of LGBTI people in our community, and that's, again, shaped by these messages we receive in the world that tells us about who we should be and who we aren't. And when we don't fit in those messages of who we are told we should be, it's being seen as a negative thing, that that's not something we should be. And stigma and prejudice and myths and stereotypes all feed into experiences of discrimination. So discrimination is that manifestation of stigma and prejudice. So this is when that stigma and prejudice and those myths and stereotypes get acted upon. And that can happen between individuals and by groups and by organisation systems. And this can range from vilifications to threats to verbal abuse, all the way through to physical assault and violence and sexual assault. And this little cartoon, actually, I've got up on this slide, is a really simple but helpful representation of this experience. So what it's showing is that essentially the more negative rhetoric, the more negative public commentary that we have around a group of people, it does result in heightened experience of violence. It's like the negative, hateful conversations essentially gives permission for people to act out their stigma and their prejudice towards LGBTI people. And certainly throughout the last year or so, certainly throughout some of the more current political conversations, there has been really strong negative rhetoric around LGBTI people within our community, particularly transgender people and non-binary people and our young people. And so as a result, people's experiences of discrimination increases alongside that increase in negative commentary. And I know this map is going to be probably difficult for people to see on your screen, but I think it's really important to note, when we take that step back from an Australian context and we look globally, that it's really important to note that globally there is a really vast, broad way of how LGBTI people are seen in the world. And there are still countries in the world that still do have the death penalty for people who are gay or people who are transgender and sit outside gender norms. There are many countries that still have imprisonment. So even though there's many countries in the world that are moving towards marriage equality and any discrimination recognition, there is a lot of space in our world that actually is not happening. There's this really strong polarization between increasing rights and equality for LGBTI people, but also increasing stigma and increasing discrimination towards LGBTI people. This is also quite pertinent, I guess, for when you're working and supporting with people from different cultures and from different backgrounds, about how people's countries of origin may influence, how do their social and cultural norms influence how they feel and think and consider gender and sexuality and diversity of bodies. And again, I'm not going to be able to do this justice, but if you're interested in the global space of equality for LGBTI people, I really encourage you to look at ILGA and to have a look at their resources and the information they have about that. So all of this, sorry, before I move on to that, so I guess all of that shapes, and when I talked earlier about heteronormativity, all of this information would be shaping a decision about am I able to disclose who I am to someone? So in Australia, we have a Sex Discrimination Act, and actually this act actually makes it unlawful to discriminate against the people on the basis of their sexual orientation, gender identity and intersex status under federal law. So there are quite significant protections for LGBTI people, and these were updated in 2013, and that actually was the first time that intersex status was also included under anti-discrimination law. However, in this, and there's a link up the top of the screen there where you can go to access more information about what laws there are to protect LGBTI people in Australia. But it is really important to note that there are certain exemptions for LGBTI people. For example, religious-based organisations are actually legally exempt from the Sex Discrimination Act. There is also an exemption to this exemption where federally funded aged care services, who are faith-based organisations, can't discriminate against LGBTI people who are receiving services from them. So this is actually not very an easy space to navigate around what are your legal protections or not. And sometimes it's not as black and white as saying that that all LGBTI people are protected under federal law, that there are these exemptions for certain bodies and groups of people, that they actually can still legally discriminate against LGBTI people. So again, a space I really encourage people to explore and to learn more about, particularly if you're working with people who are experiencing discrimination. So again, reflecting back on that question earlier about heteronormativity, about the impact, and this is a slide from the research paper Closer Look at Private Lives Too, which asked the question, in the past year, have you hidden your sexuality or gender identity? The one I'd like to draw your attention to here is around accessing services, where 22% people have said they occasionally and 12% said they usually hide their sexuality or gender identity from their service providers. So again, reflecting back on heteronormativity in of itself might seem like a really innocuous, minute thing, but what that does, it gives LGBTI people this space to actually go and decide, do I disclose who I am? Do I correct this assumption? And that decision is often based on all those things I just talked about. So myths, stereotypes, stigma, prejudice, discrimination, and all comes together about, do I actually tell this person who I am? And it's like weighing up the pros and cons of that decision. And what we're seeing is that there are a large number of LGBTI people who are still choosing to hide who they are from service providers because of that fear or uncertainty about what might happen if they do disclose. And that often means that as service providers, we're not receiving all the information we need to best support someone around what they might be needing. So I'm going to be touching on just some statistics. Statistics can be really helpful, and I guess reminding people that I am focusing on the negative experiences and negative health outcomes of being LGBTI. And at the Alliance, we've put together a document called Statistics at a Glance, where it's not a comprehensive literature review, but we have pulled together some key statistics about the mental health outcomes for LGBTI people in Australia. So if you're utilising statistics to advocate change within your organisation or to talk about the experiences of being LGBTI, that's a useful document to pull things from. It is mindful, though, when we're talking about research and statistics, that there is a significant amount of gaps, and there's lots that we actually don't know around the mental health outcomes of our communities. So I'm going to cover some statistics that we do know. Certainly this will also emerge a little bit about what we don't know. And I think it is really okay to say that we don't know some things around the health outcomes of LGBTI people, because that also can encourage and drive our sector to invest in research and to improve data collection, which will help us fill in some of these gaps as well. Oh, I'm sorry, that has come up as black and white. I'm not sure why that has, and I apologise for that. It's usually much more colourful. This slide looks at mental health diagnosis, and on the left-hand side, the black graph there, it says about 20% of the general population have been diagnosed with a mental health disorder over the last sort of 12 months to 3 years. And I'm sorry that the numbers aren't coming up well. I'll make sure that this is okay when I upload the copy of the slides. But effectively, as the columns go along, it's got gay men, lesbian women, bisexual men, bisexual women, trans men, trans women, and intersex. And as what we can generally see is that across that LGBTI space, that there is a higher representation of mental health disorder diagnosis across the LGBT space. For intersex people, we actually don't have statistics on the mental health diagnosis for intersex people. So that little column there says not applicable. We actually don't have access to information. Top right-hand side of the slide is where those statistics have been received from. And again, I apologise for the black and white nature of this. So again, this is looking at psychological distress. So looking at the experiences of psychological distress. And again, in the general population is about 9.2%. And those experiences are much more heightened across our LGBTI communities. And so we can see there's varying experiences between sexuality and gender and intersex, that this again really points out to this is the lack of a homogenous nature of our community, that there's a varying range of experiences. And again, here's another slide looking at suicide attempts over lifetime. So in the general population, around 3.2% of the general population attempt suicide in their lifetime. And as we can see across the LGBTI spectrum, that is significantly higher. So for gay men, that sits around 14%, lesbian women 20%, 9% for bisexual men, 10% for bisexual women, 35% for transgender people, and 19% for intersex people. So again, LGBTI people more generally have a higher risk of suicide attempts in a lifetime, but within our LGBTI community, we can see that different groups have different experiences. So certainly trans and gender diverse people have a much higher rate of suicide attempts compared to lesbian, gay, bisexual people. And I guess if we reflect earlier on the narrative where we're talking about experiences of stigma and discrimination and how that impacts on mental well-being, we know that trans and gender diverse people are usually much more vulnerable to experiences of stigma and discrimination. So we can see this correlation between experiences of stigma and discrimination and poorer health outcomes. When we're talking about death by suicide, it's really important to we actually don't have any data available on the number of LGBTI people who've died by suicide. This is because sexuality and gender identity beyond male or female and intersex status are actually not recorded in standard data collection on suicide registers. Occasionally, LGBTI identity might be captured in the qualitative sections of reports. But I think this is why it's important. I think often in our sector and community, we often rely on using the statistic of this many, this percentage of LGBTI people die by suicide, or LGBTI people are most likely to die by suicide. But this is actually one of the things that we don't know. We can say that due to what we do know around heightened rates of diagnosis of mental health disorders, particularly anxiety and depression, heightened rates of psychological distress, and heightened rates of thoughts about suicide and suicide attempts. All that information tells us that it is very likely that LGBTI people are much more likely to die by suicide. But we actually can't factually say that until there is more data collected. But all the information we have available around mental health and wellbeing outcomes certainly indicates that that would be a likely outcome. One way to talk about this relationship between our experiences of stigma and discrimination and these poor mental health outcomes is to talk about minority stress. Minority stress is the daily constant low-level stresses in the lives of many LGBTI people. And these can be those actual experiences of stigma, prejudice and discrimination that can range from experiences of assumption of gender norms all the way through to violence and assault, but also the expectation that as an LGBTI person that you will accept and prejudice. To let me know. Okay. Drop out. I'm hoping that people can still see and hear me. Please just type me a little message in the text box if everything is all going okay. Minority stress. All good, excellent, wonderful, wonderful. So not only about do people actually experience stigma, prejudice, discrimination, but actually that as LGBTI people, we walk through the world expecting that we're going to experience stigma and discrimination. And also within LGBTI spaces is this internalization of these negative messages that we all, as LGBTI people, we also live in the same world that is filled with myths and stereotypes and stigma and prejudice. And as LGBTI people, we also absorb those messages and often come to believe those messages as to be true, but not only true about this external LGBTI group of people, but also true about myself. I am the thing I was taught to hate. So we can see how that would really impact on someone's mental health and well-being. And the other aspect to minority stress is about, as LGBTI people, we often will adapt our behaviour to prevent these experiences of stigma and discrimination. We can choose to blend in, we'll choose not to disclose, we'll choose to not tell people who we are as a way to avoid experiences of stigma and discrimination. And some people within the LGBTI space are more able to do that. So when we talk about sexuality, sometimes it's much more easier to hide that from the community, but often as transgender and gender diverse people, that often is very a visible experience. And I think it's really important to say that actually often, sometimes despite knowing as trans and gender diverse people that you're going to experience harassment, stigma and prejudice and discrimination, that trans people still will enter the world as who they are, being authentic to who they are, regardless of those experiences. And touching on that experiences of resilience, I think that in particular speaks to resilience that is really strong within our LGBTI communities, and that actually the ability to adapt our behaviour to prevent experiences of stigma and discrimination is representative of that resilience as well. So here's again touch on that resilience, and I think it's really important that often when I've spent this time talking about these are the health outcomes and these are the negative health experiences of LGBTI people, that again is really important to bring back that as LGBTI people and communities, there's a really long history of resilience that communities have gathered and challenged stigma and prejudice they experience. And again, in recent political times, we've seen that once again. So the LGBTI community is being visible and challenging experiences of stigma and discrimination that they're experiencing in the public space. So this has been a really quick whirlwind tour of LGBTI mental health. And as I come towards the end, I'm encouraging people to provide some questions. I will just go through a few resources and then I'll look at the questions that I've been receiving. Just to remind people, this is one resource that may be useful to people. This is a strategy document that the National LGBTI Health Alliance has produced, which outlines some of the activities and actions that we believe need to happen to improve the mental health of LGBTI people in Australia. So things that need to happen at the systemic structural level in our society, so that policy level. So this might be useful to organisations who are advocating for change within your organisations. QLife has also released a diverse number of QLife guides for the professionals working in the LGBTI space. So you can just head up to that web link there and download these really helpful guides about particular topics. So these guides will help you dive into a bit more depth some of the things that I'm really only able to touch on quite lightly here today. And QLife is also a really useful resource. This is really useful for LGBTI people themselves. So QLife is a peer telephone counselling service, volunteer run. So all the people on the other end of the lines are LGBTI people themselves. But this also can be useful for people working in the LGBTI space to also access knowledge and resources and information about how do you best work with LGBTI people. And here are my contact details here as well at the end. And heading to the National LGBTI Health Alliance website, we have a section of that website called the Knowledge Hub, which is a space where we collect all the different bits of work that we do, including the webinars that we record for Network Mind Out. So I really encourage you to go along and to look at all the different resources that we have there. So I'm just going to look at the questions that people have been submitted. And actually the ones that have been submitted was about me dropping out. So actually no specific content questions. So I'm happy if people have any questions to please submit those there up to the question box now. I really appreciate, I know this was a really quick foundational tour to LGBTI. Mental health. Every month, Network Mind Out will do a new webinar, and the intent for many of those often is to delve deeper into more specific knowledge. So certainly topics we'll be looking at would be LGBTI younger people, LGBTI people with disabilities, culturally and linguistically diverse LGBTI people, trans and gender diverse people. So we'll be really delving into a lot of more of these specific experiences around LGBTI mental health that I'm hoping this webinar today provided a bit more of a foundational concept to. So just a question from Diana about, I work in an environment where it's deemed that there may be a small population of LGBTI community and therefore a support group for young people may not be important. How can I shift this perception? Yeah, I guess that's actually really, I guess that's sometimes challenging because often then organisations will often ask for what are the statistics, and sometimes it's very difficult to actually go, this is actually what we know. So I guess I would encourage you to go back to the slide I had around statistics and pull out some of those, and certainly some of the schools research looking at younger people certainly shows that a significant portion of young people identify themselves as not being heterosexual. So they might not yet be using words like gay, lesbian, bi or trans, but identifying as not being heterosexual. And so that might help give that perception that actually this is a larger portion of people. And also perhaps even if the LGBTI community might be a small portion of the community, of the sector that you're working in, does not mean that their experiences aren't still important, that even if actually one person or two people can benefit from targeted support, that in itself should be quite meaningful. Just because there might be a small number of people doesn't actually mean that their experiences aren't ones that really need support. So sometimes I find using some of the things I've used in today's webinar about this is who LGBTI people are, this is what we know about their lives, this is what we know about their health outcomes, can be really helpful to try and shift that perception that actually this is something that's important, not just for the LGBTI sector to be talking about, but everyone within within mental health and suicide prevention should also be talking about. And yes, so please, this webinar has been recorded and will be uploaded onto the Knowledge Hub on the Alliance website next couple of days, along with the slides from today's webinar. So please share. This is all public access and very shareable. So please do that. So also a question from Lisa. I understand that some services are beginning to do research on the impact of marriage equality, counselling survey on LGBTI communities. Do I know of any emerging information? Certainly, there is some new emerging information. The National LGBTI Health Alliance did some research in conjunction with the Australia Institute, and some preliminary results have now been released there, and I believe actually they should be on the Alliance website, but I do know they're actually still in the process of analysing that data a lot more deeply to actually give an idea about what was the true impact on the community. I guess certainly what we know from narratives and stories and what people were sharing throughout that time was certainly that people, LGBTI people and communities, as well as their allies, were experiencing more impact on their mental health. And I'm hoping that the research that was done in that time will actually reveal that in a more statistical way that often is important to advocate for further change to happen in the sector. So I think certainly on that one, that's a bit of a watch this space, but certainly the stories people were sharing throughout that time was one of a very significant impact on their mental health. So thank you everyone for joining me today for this webinar. I really appreciate everyone for joining us, and please keep an eye out for the recording of this on the Alliance website over the next couple of days. And I look forward to seeing everybody next month for the next Network Mind Out webinar, and keep an eye out, just subscribe to Network Mind Out newsletters to get updates and invitations for the online webinars. So thank you.